Miller was born in the state of Texas in the 1980s along with his younger brother Tommy. As a teenager, Joel would end up getting his girlfriend pregnant, and soon after, his daughter Sarah would be born. Joel and the mother would try to make things work, but for unknown reasons, while Sarah was still young, the mother would leave, forcing Joel to raise Sarah all on his own. Despite this, Joel had a happy life with Sarah, working hard to support his family. However, his life would fall apart on September 27, 2013, when an outbreak of a mutated strain of cordyceps would start infecting people in their hometown, and Joel would take Sarah and Tommy and they'd try to flee but would be caught in a car accident. With Sarah's legs being broken, Joel would carry his daughter outside to the city where they'd be confronted by a soldier who would be given orders not to let anyone escape and would open fire. However, Tommy would shoot the soldier, saving his brother. But Sarah had unfortunately been hit and would shortly pass away in his arms. The outbreak would quickly overtake the country and eventually the world. And over the next 20 years, Joel would become disconnected and jaded, doing whatever it took to survive. Scavenging, stealing, and even killing to keep him and Tommy alive. And while Joel was able to put his humanity to the side in order to survive these events, they would end up traumatizing Tommy, who would go on to later join the terrorist organization known as the Fireflies. By the events of the game, Joel had a new partner, a woman named Tess. One day, Joel and Tess would confront a man named Roberts who owned them guns, only to find after confronting him that he had given them to the Fireflies. Tess would then execute Robert, only for the leader of the Fireflies, Marlene, to show up, and she would agree to give them the guns they owed if they did a job for her. Agreeing, they'd follow her and end up meeting a teenage girl named Ellie, who Marlene would ask them to smuggle out of the safe zone. And after Tess would verify that Marlene had still had their guns, they'd end up agreeing. After evading Fedra agents, the two would discover that Ellie was special, being immune to the fungal infection, and that the Fireflies wanted to create a cure using her. They then reached the meeting place only to discover the corpses of the people they were meant to meet. Tess would grow frantic and would reveal that she had been bitten, convincing Joel to take Ellie to his brother, who would know where to take her. Joel and Ellie would sneak away from the Fedra agents as Tess took a lax stand to hold them off. The pair would make their way to an abandoned town where they would meet Joel's friend Bill, who owed them a favor, and after being ambushed by infected and finding the body of Bill's partner, they'd get a car working and would escape the town. Ellie and Joel would then drive until being ambushed and would be forced to fight their way out, with Ellie even saving Joel, and while he'd initially chastised her for not staying back, he decided to let her help, giving her a gun and trusting her to help him. The two would then run into the brothers Henry and Sam. And after a brief scuffle, they'd realize that they weren't part of the group that was chasing them, and they'd agree to work together, escaping but running into infected. After getting to a safe position, Ellie would check in on Sam, trying to comfort him, admitting that her greatest fear was ending up all alone. Waking up the next day, Ellie would be attacked by an infected Sam, who would then have to be put down by Henry, who, consumed by guilt, would take his own life. Ellie and Joel would then continue traveling until meeting Tommy at the settlement of Jackson, where Joel would try to convince Tommy to take Ellie the rest of the way, convincing him after seeing how much Ellie clearly meant to him. Ellie would then run off, having discovered what Joel was planning, forcing him to track her down to a farmhouse, where she would be confronted by Joel, and the two would get into an argument, and while Joel seemed firm, after a brief fight with bandits, Joel would leave with Ellie, taking her to the hospital Tommy believed the Fireflies were staying at. However, the place would be abandoned and they would be ambushed by bandits, and Joel would be severely injured, forcing Ellie to take care of him until he got better. One day, Joel would wake up to find Ellie missing, and would discover that some members of the group that had attacked them was around, and after subduing them and tying them up as well as torturing them into revealing the camp's location, he would execute them. Sneaking into the camp, Joel would come across Ellie killing a bandit and would comfort her after she broke down, and they'd end up leaving together. Picking back up on the Fireflies trail and traveling to Salt Lake City, they would search for them, but Ellie would be knocked out and Joel would be knocked unconscious trying to revive her. Later, waking up in the Firefly base where he would be told that Ellie wouldn't survive the operation, and refusing to let yet another daughter die, Joel would fight his way through the hospital where he'd eventually find Ellie being prepared for surgery. And he'd be forced to kill at least one of the doctors who drew a scalpel on him before taking Ellie to the parking lot before being confronted by Marlene, who would argue that he knew that this is what Ellie would want. Knowing deep down that Marlene was right, Joel would be conflicted for a brief second. However, refusing to lose Ellie, Joel would kill Marlene and would take her back to Jackson, claiming that there were dozens of other immune people out there, and that none other had produced a cure. And while it's uncertain if Ellie truly believed him, she would stay in the settlement, and they both lived happily ever. Oh, wait, there was a sequel? Oh, I wonder what he did. Negan Smith was born in the state of Virginia, and while not much is known about his early life, he would grow up to meet a woman named Lucille, whom he would go on to marry. One day, while he and Lucille were at a bar, a drunk man would disrespect Lucille, greatly angering Negan, who would snap and beat the man until he was unconscious. Later, as it would turn out, this man had children who attended the high school Negan taught gym at, and Negan would end up losing his job and would be sued, resulting in a depression that would eventually lead him to sleeping with his wife's best friend. One night, after coming home from his affair, he would learn that Lucille had cancer and would immediately cease the affair, focusing entirely on her. However, during Lucille's treatment, the wildfire virus outbreak would destroy civilization, which would force Negan to go out searching for supplies. They were able to live comfortably for a time, with Negan even teaching himself how to give her chemotherapy. However, one night, Negan would leave the freezer door open slightly, ruining the fluid. He would immediately start preparing to set out and get more fluid from a traveling doctor he had been told about. However, Lucille would sit him down and tell him that she knew why he was trying so hard to be better, because of the affair. However, he had made it up to her and that she had forgiven him, and now she just wanted him to live for himself and to accept her fate. Negan wouldn't listen, however, and would still leave, and while he had trouble, he managed to track down the doctor and would attempt to rob him. However, the man's daughter would knock him out with a baseball bat. Negan would then wake up having been tended to by the doctor, who, after hearing Negan's story, would actually give Negan the supplies he was looking for, and would even feed him, and the man's daughter would give him the baseball bat as a means to protect himself now that they knew that his gun was empty. However, on his way back, Negan would be captured by a biker gang, and while he stalled for time and tried to mislead them, after having a gun to his head and knowing Lucille wouldn't last long, he gave up the doctor and his daughter being set free after they were captured. Upon returning home, Negan would discover that the power was out and that a message had been left for him on the door, opening it to find that Lucille had taken her own life. Initially, Negan would move in to put down the zombified Lucille, however, he was unable to go through with it. However, as her message asked for him not to leave her that way, he would douse their room in gasoline and set fire to it, leaving his reanimated wife to burn, not unable to watch any further. It was here where he would wrap the bat given to him by barbed wire and would name it after Lucille. Now, with nothing left to lose, as both an act of revenge and to save the people who had helped him, Negan will return to the biker's hideout, killing everyone except the leader. Negan would then spend a couple of minutes venting to the man, telling him about the incident that had started his downfall, before finally giving in to his darker nature and beating the man to death with Lucille. This event would be Negan's driving force, which would push him to become a monster, creating the Saviors and ruling his territory with brutality and cruelty, which he would go on to do for years until encountering a man named Rick Grimes. Hey people, Rain here, bringing you yet another requested match, this time from the user Wayora, who wanted me to pit the main protagonist from the Last of Us game, Joel Miller, up against Negan, the main antagonist of seasons 7 through 8 of The Walking Dead TV series, in another battle of survivors in what is sort of a sequel to last season's Clementine vs. Ellie, as I'm once again using my favorite Walking Dead character from the media he appears in, as well as my favorite character from the Last of Us series. Now, for this fight, I will be taking Joel exclusively from the first game, as the second literally has one example I could use, and it was performed while on an adrenaline rush against an already weakened bloater, so I actually don't think that Joel cutting apart that bloater is as impressive as it looks. And for Negan, this will be him as he was during the events of Season 8, as after the time skip between seasons, he has passed his prime by a few years. Now, for this video, I actually won't be going over physical abilities, as both The Last of Us and The Walking Dead TV show don't depict their characters as anything more well-built humans, with examples like Joel and Negan being some of the most physically capable characters in each series. Both are in their late 40s to early 50s, both are in excellent shape physically and can kill people with their bare hands. And despite both taking a good amount of punishment, neither has survived anything that would be impossible for you or me to survive. The biggest difference would actually be in their physical builds, with Negan being about 3 inches taller based on the actor Jeffrey Dean Morgan at 6'1", and having a more muscular build compared to Joel, who is about 5'10" and with a stockier build. So if you really push me on it, I'd say that Negan has the very slight advantage physically. But to be honest, it absolutely will not affect the outcome of this fight. So this time I guess we're going to start this by looking at their weapons and equipment. Now for this match, I will be giving both opponents a total of 4 weapons, 3 firearms including a handgun, a shotgun, and an assault rifle, as well as 1 melee weapon each. For Joel, this will be selected from its in-game inventory. For Negan, I admittedly had to go looking for specific scenes of Negan actually using firearms, as they are few and far between, including an example I had to use from Season 10. However, considering these weapons already existed in his world, it is possible for him to have had them at the time of Season 8. I'm simply going off weapons that he has been shown to use. Also, I would once again like to remind everyone that I am not an expert on firearms, and that most of my information is gathered from the Internet Movie Firearm Database. So if I'm wrong about the specifics of a gun, I am sorry. However, this is based off the best information I could find. As a survivor for 20 years, Joel learned to use and be proficient with several types of firearms, and was capable of switching between them on the fly depending on the needs of the situation. For melee weapons, I'll be granting Joel a standard machete. This weapon is a 2-foot blade with a single edge, and is very versatile, being capable of both cutting and chopping away at his opponents. Joel's primary handgun was the Taurus Model 66. This revolver could fire up to 7.357 Magnum rounds before needing to reload at an effective range of 150 feet. His shotgun was the Mossberg 500, having been given to him by Bill. This weapon fired 12 as well as 20 gauge shells, and while we don't know what Joel used during the game, I doubt he was picky with his ammo. This weapon had an internal tube magazine that could hold a total of 9 shells, including the one chambered, with an effective firing range of 330 feet. The final weapon Joel will gain, both in the game and for this match, is the M16A4 assault rifle. Like most M16 models, it fired 5.56mm bullets with a muzzle velocity of 3,100 feet a second with a 20-round magazine. This version of the weapon has an effective range of 2,600 feet and doesn't actually function as a standard assault rifle, instead only having semi-auto and burst fire modes. Negan has used a variety of weapons while surviving and as the leader of the Saviors. However, he never stuck to more than one weapon for a long time, with a single exception of Lucille, the baseball bat named after his wife that was given to him by Laura. Negan would go on to wrap the bat in barbed wire. He would use this weapon to cause lethal amounts of damage with a single swing, with the barbed wire seemingly only causing flesh wounds, which honestly probably wouldn't even penetrate thicker layers of clothing. However, considering that Negan also uses Lucille on the undead, it's likely that the barbed wire is contaminated with the wildfire virus, which could infect someone who manages to only be injured by the weapon. During the early days of the infection, Negan used a Colt M1911A1. This handgun has a magazine of 8 bullets, fires 45 ACP rounds, and has an effective firing range of about 160 feet, making it an excellent sidearm for close to mid-range combat. In Season 10, Episode 4, Negan briefly used a 12-gauge sawed-off shotgun. This weapon can hold up to 2 shells before needing to reload. While the weapon can be used at up to ranges of 60 feet, its slower muzzle velocity makes it even more specialized for close-range encounters than a standard shotgun, with the pellet spread making it far more dangerous at close ranges. However, kill shots are still very possible at even max range. In Season 7, Episode 1, Negan used an M4A1 assault rifle. This weapon fires 5.56mm bullets out of a 30-round magazine at 700 rounds a minute, with a muzzle velocity of 3,000 feet a second and a firing range of 1,600 feet. Right, this one has a bit to go over, so I'll save the commentary for later and get right into it. Starting with the melee weapons, Joel's machete and Negan's Lucille serve completely different purposes, both having advantages and disadvantages. Joel's machete would be a faster weapon and can quickly cause fatal damage with a slash to the right area. Lucille, on the other hand, while slower, would be easier to defend with due to its longer length, and can disable an opponent by breaking their arm or leg or rupturing organs, if hit with enough force. I have to favor Lucille slightly overall, as it would require less effort and precision to cause serious injury to an opponent, on top of being about a foot longer. As for their handguns, I honestly think they're about even, though Joel is using the better ammo. Negan's 45 ACP rounds will still cause more damage than standard 9mm, and Negan's handgun does have 10 more feet of range and 1 more bullet in the magazine, so considering all of these slight advantages, I'll say they're even, but if you really had to press me, I'd say that Negan's gun is fractionally better. Joel easily has the better shotgun. More ammunition without needing to reload, and about 5 times the range makes this no contest. The machine guns are both pretty good, with one noticeable difference. They both use the same ammunition and both fire their shots at around 3,000 feet a second. And while Joel does have an extra 1,000 feet of range, in most cases, Negan is still going to have him in range unless Joel sneaks away. And if you're going with that strategy, it would be better to just shoot him in the back anyway. The only real difference I see that will play a role mid-combat is that Negan's assault rifle has 10 extra rounds to use, giving him the better gun for practical uses. This was pretty close, with some weapons having very minor differences, but overall, Negan has the advantage here, with his melee weapon being better and his pistol and assault rifle having more ammo. And while Joel does have the range advantage at over 2,000 feet, Joel is better off disengaging from the fight entirely than making a ludicrous amount of space just to start shooting again. And so, I give Negan the edge in weapons and equipment. As a survivor in the apocalypse, Joel quickly adapted into a ruthless and unfeeling combatant, willing to put anyone who came at him into the ground. As a smuggler, Joel learned to use stealth to his advantage, having trained his senses to pick on the position of a nearby target, and he uses the skill to maneuver around and eliminate those in his way, often picking off large groups one by one until they're either enough for him to take down with his firepower or until none remain. He's also competent in firefights, accurately taking down entire groups of hostile survivors, implementing flanking maneuvers, stealth, and various other simple but effective tactics. In melee combat, Joel subscribes to the belief that the best defense is a good offense, beating down most of his opponents, most of the time to the death, never going on the defensive or even letting himself be forced into doing so, always doing whatever he can to reverse the situation even on the infected. To Despite appearing to be nothing but a meathead at first, after years of losing his humanity and being forced to survive in the zombie apocalypse, Negan has become deceptively cunning and skilled, with his tactics on multiple occasions showing the ability to use stealth and the environment to his advantage in a fight. Early on, he snuck into the biker base, stealthily killing a few members before taking their guns and finishing the rest off, as well as getting the jump on Rick, hiding in his home before ambushing him, as well as leading him into more favorable positions, forcing Rick to fight where Negan wanted to, or leading Beta into a trap so that Daryl could take him down. However, that doesn't mean that he can't throw down like the rest of them. In fact, he seems to prefer fighting this way, overpowering Rick twice and killed Simon with his bare hands. However, he isn't properly trained, and against masters of CQC, he doesn't stand a chance, being forced to rely on underhanded methods to hold his own. Well, this was a surprise. Joel and Negan actually turned out to be very similar combatants, with both men being capable of stealth as well as a frontal assault, beating down their opponents, overwhelming others with their brute strength alone, and actually prefer fighting this way. Both are willing to use the environment to their advantages, and both are skilled in stealth, able to pick off groups one by one or work around a particular opponent. So with these two being so similar, for me, what this category comes down to is experience. And that being said, Joel holds the clear edge in that area for two big reasons. Firstly, Joel's outbreak had been going on for about 20 years in comparison to The Walking Dead, where, going by the episode Here's Negan, by the events of season 10, it had only been around 13 years, with most sources saying that the time skip between seasons 8 and 9 was 6 years, meaning that at most, Negan had 7 years of experience, less than half of Joel's. But it actually gets a little worse, as you need to remember that Negan was for at least a few years of that time, meaning that he likely didn't see much action during that time, instead focusing on leading his people. And so I give Joel the edge in combat skills and tactics. Let's set up this fight. Let's say it takes place in the Raccoon City Park from Resident Evil 3, and that Negan and Joel have met before, and that there's some unfinished business between the two. Joel watched as Ellie hit the ground with a dull thud, immediately drawing his gun and firing on the wall she had passed, rushing in and pulling the girl to safety before re-rolling his revolver. Ah shit, thought that was gonna be you. Sorry about the kid, collateral and all. Joel lets out what could best be described as a growl, checking Ellie over, examining the welt already growing where the bat made contact. If she doesn't get up, I swear to God you're gonna suffer as long as I can keep you alive. Oh, come on, Joel. We both know if I was going for the kill, you'd be looking at the inside of her brain instead of a bump. Joel, after checking her pulse and being satisfied that he can deal with Negan while Ellie rests, aims his gun and gets ready. Now come on out and let's settle this like men. Joel hesitates for a second, but relents, saying fine. However, in reality, he grabs a nearby brick and lazily tosses it at the ground while aiming his gun. And as expected, Negan turns the corner saying, "Gotcha!" with his handgun drawn, only to get shot in the side by Joel's gun, immediately scrambling back into cover, groaning. Okay, you know what, that's fair. While looking out, seeing Joel move from one piece of cover, and staying patient, and taking aim as Joel moves again, nearly hitting him in the legs. Joel opens fire and a brief shootout ensues until both men run out of ammo with their main guns. Joel spins back into cover and starts reloading his gun. Meanwhile, Negan drops his handgun and takes aim with his sawed-off shotgun, firing into Joel's cover, surprising the man. Negan gets ready to take off Joel's head when the man in question turns the corner, striking the sawed-off shotgun away, just as he pulls the trigger and delivers a hook at Negan, which the man ducks under before getting his own punch across Joel's jaw. Ignoring the pain and blood running down his lips, Joel charges, sending them both to the ground. As he rolls, Joel grabs for his shotgun, only for Negan to kick it from his hands before he can even use it. The two struggle on the ground for a minute, but Negan eventually gets the upper hand, getting on top of him, but Joel kicks him off and onto the ground. The two men stand up and go for their final ranged weapons, while diving for cover. Joel is the first to get a few shots off, keeping Negan still for the moment, but he knows this is doing nothing more than stalling and gets back into cover to think of a way to take his opponent down. Meanwhile, Negan starts laying down suppressive fire while moving in before taking cover by a fountain. Joel, seeing this, does the same, but backs up into further cover to keep some distance. This plays out for a couple of minutes until Joel's rifle runs dry and he drives for cover. Joel reloads his gun and peeks out, only for his heart to sink as he sees Negan with his handgun still on Joel, but his rifle trained on Ellie's skull. Calling out for Negan to wait, Joel throws his rifle to the side and holds up his hands. Negan smirks and tells him to drop the revolver too, which Joel tries to say he dropped in the fight, only to irritate Negan. Come on, Joel, you know I don't want to kill the kid, but I sure as shit will if you don't stop jerking me off right now. Joel slowly reaches behind his back and similarly drops the Taurus, flinging it a few feet away. Going for his machete next, he stopped when Negan simply tells him to stop. "Nah, you can keep that one," he says, tossing his own rifle away but holstering his handgun before reaching over his shoulder and pulling out a baseball bat wrapped in barbed wire. "After all, you don't think I'm gonna do this without Lucille, do you?" Joel silently draws his machete and stomps closer as Negan does the same, twirling Lucille in his hands. Negan acts first, swinging at Joel, who ducks under the bat and slashes at Negan with the machete, narrowly missing as Negan hops back. Joel doesn't let up though and hacks down at the bigger man, but the blade is stopped in its tracks and embedded into Lucille. Joel pulls his weapon free, but as he does, Negan slams the end into his eye, stunning him and leaving him open for a swing to the leg, fracturing his femur. Continuing his momentum, Negan slams Lucille into Joel's chest, knocking the wind from him and dropping him to his hands and knees as his blade falls to the ground in front of him. Negan finishes the assault, bringing the bat down onto Joel's back. Hitting the ground with several broken ribs, he still manages to crawl forward as Negan advances on him, raising Lucille as he says something that the ringing in Joel's ears drowns out. Negan is ready to cave in Joel's skull when Joel suddenly spins, cutting Negan across the leg with his blade. Moving back, Joel begins swinging wildly, a few strikes landing on Negan's chest and arms, his leather jacket only slightly dampening the dulled blade, stopping any internal injuries, but the flesh wounds and pain are very real. However, Joel ends up putting too much weight onto his injured knee and he stumbles, giving Negan the opportunity to swing Lucille, the blade shattering against the metal-wrapped bat as Negan headbutts Joel, putting him onto the ground. Negan then jumps on his enemy, pinning Joel's neck to the ground with Lucille, and he begins to push down harder and harder. Joel reaches up, gouging Negan's eye and clawing in his face, only for Negan to bite down, taking off a chunk from in between Joel's thumb and index finger. The smuggler's eyes start to roll back as his vision grows dark and the pressure on his windpipe grows and grows until suddenly a loud noise ends the struggle. Negan looks down, unmoving, as his blood spills from the gunshot, seeing Joel holding his own gun before aiming up and shooting Negan in the head, killing him instantly. Joel then throws his body off to the side and takes a second to catch his breath before limping back over to Ellie, who is just now getting back on her feet. And with that, I declare Joel Miller the survivor, the winner. Well, I can honestly say that despite knowing who was going to win going into this, it was a lot closer than I was expecting. As to be honest, I originally dropped The Walking Dead after they killed their best character. So I'm just now seeing a lot of what Negan brings to the table, and I have to say, he deserves far more credit than I gave him, giving Joel a serious run for his money. As I said, Negan has the very slight physical edge, but this was only due to his build, and it's something that can very easily be compensated for in a fight. Their weaponry honestly didn't have that much of a gap either. Negan's weapons mainly have more rounds, but Joel did have the range advantage and the better shotgun, with Lucille honestly being what tipped it over for Negan. Combat skills, while similar, isn't as close as the other areas. Sure, Negan fights like Joel to an extent, but he isn't as experienced as Joel, not having fought for nearly as long, and while I didn't bring this up in the analysis, Joel squaring up against Infected would better condition him against someone who with Negan's fighting style. Now, to be clear, if we are using Joel from The Last of Us 2 and Negan from seasons 9 through 11, this fight would actually go to Negan, as Joel by that point had become far more soft and a bit rusty, as this is the canonic reason for his death as stated by Joel's actor Troy Baker in an interview in which the main writer Neil Druckmann was present for and didn't contradict. Meanwhile, Negan has been surviving and fighting like a normal survivor for much longer, meaning that under those conditions, Negan would sweep every category as Joel would just be too rusty to take the combat skills and tactics. As Joel would just be too rusty to take the combat skills category. But that's just my opinion. What do you think? Do you agree that Joel's superior experience would let him take Negan down, or do you think that Negan's small advantages with weapon and physicality will let him put Joel down before someone else got the chance? Let me know in the comments down below. If I got anything wrong, please feel free to correct me. Right, please rate, comment, and subscribe if you enjoyed this video, as I have plenty more like it. I also have Twitter and Discord where you can talk to me directly, as well as links to the channels Winter Ghost and 3 Tactics Gamer, all in the description. Right, with all that, I'm Ray932, and I'll see you next time.
Go! brother and get out of here!
I will return with help! You stall him until then!
I won't hold my breath.
I'm an angel with a shotgun, fighting till the war's won. I don't care if heaven won't take me back. I'll throw away my faith, babe, just to keep you safe. Don't you know you're everything I have? And I want to live, not just survive. And I'm gonna hide my way tonight. You better know what you're fighting for. Well, baby, you are all that I adore.